I'm gonna mute myself and then I'm gonna admit everybody and I'll allow Amanda to kick it off, but I'll send you a chat, Amanda, in a couple seconds.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Good luck, everyone.
Good luck. Oh, John Gagliano.
Welcome, everyone. I think we're waiting for some folks to log on, so we'll give it a few minutes. Wonderful to see some familiar faces and some new ones. Okay. Well, it looks like we have some folks calling in, but I think we're ready to start. So I would like to kick us off tonight. My name's Amanda Claus. I'm serving as the interim vice president for university advancement here at Monmouth University. Proud alumna myself, and we are really excited to be hosting tonight's webinar. I would like to also start by thanking you all, not just for joining, but for your wonderful support as part of your registration for joining tonight. You were able to support our Monmouth Fund, which helps to support all of our students here at Monmouth and the great work that we're doing. So thank you for being a part of our donor community by way of attending this event tonight. Tonight, as you know, is going to feature the Urban Coast Institute, which is one of our centers of distinction here on campus, and if I might say, a point of pride for all of us, and I'm sure for many of you at home. You might know that the Urban Coast Institute is celebrating their 15th anniversary this year, so we are excited that they've been supporting our coastal resiliency efforts by way of research and education for 15 years strong, and we know that we'll continue to move forward with their support and collaboration at Monmouth in the future. Some of what you'll hear about as recent successes for the Urban Coast Institute will be coming out soon with their annual report. So if any of you are interested in receiving a personal copy of that, please feel free to reach out. If not, we'll make sure to share a digital copy of that when it becomes available and following this event. A few housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we ask that you please save them for the end during our Q&A and discussion portion. If by chance you have to log off and you'd like to rejoin, we can be sure to do so through the waiting room, but we are also going to be recording this event in case you'd like to rewatch what you've participated in this evening. If you don't mind keeping your microphones on mute, we'd appreciate it. I will cut down on any background noise throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I would like the opportunity to introduce our real host for the evening, Tony McDonald, who many of you know and serves as the director for the Urban Coast Institute. Tony will be making introductions to our participants tonight and our panelists. So with that, Tony.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. Appreciate you pulling this together, and a special thanks to Laura McDonald, who has really been helping us organize this. And Laura will be monitoring the chat. So please, if you put questions in there, make sure you can do that. Put the questions in as we go along, but we'll get to them at the end. So before I'll introduce the actual other speakers, presenters, after I finish my remarks, but I did also want to just thank and point out Carl Villacoba. He's our communications director at the Urban Coast Institute, and he does a fantastic job. So if anybody's interested in anything, we can only scratch the surface today in the short time we have together. Please reach out to Carl or Laura, Amanda, and we'll be happy to fill in the blanks and actually expand on what we do. So if you haven't checked out our website, please do that. It's great to see some familiar names and start to meet some other partners in this exercise. My job today is really to give you a sort of an introduction to today's topics, which is climate and the coasts. UCI does a lot of different things, but really, I think this really kind of is a good umbrella for many of the activities that we do. I'm actually going to start us off by talking a little bit about what the Biden administration is doing and why that makes a difference, specifically to some of the work that we do at the Urban Coast Institute, but also try to also make it relevant to those of you who have joined us from Florida. So these are issues which I think it is not difficult for you all to understand in your personal experience, make a real difference in people's lives every day if they live in New Jersey or Florida or anywhere along the coast. So really a pleasure to sort of start this out. I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to cover a little bit about some of the Biden administration, some of their appointments. Some of you may be aware that they recently issued a climate executive order. I'm going to focus on some elements of that that really I think are specifically relevant, and also I think tee up some of the discussions from the professors that are here after I finish. And then I'm going to talk about some other specific activities that UCI is doing that relate and support some of these activities. I need to say, when I talk about UCI, Amanda called us a center of distinction. That just means I get to wear the blue blazer even when I'm working from home during the pandemic. So other than that, I would say the center of distinction is not just our staff. It is very much us leveraging our ability to focus on how we can work with our students to engage issues around our community and frankly around the world. And you'll hear some examples of how we do that. So we really look to leverage the expertise of our partners on the faculty and the expertise of the students. Don't forget, we don't teach the students, they teach us. So it really is a great opportunity for us to, what I like to say is the Mid-Atlantic is a fantastic laboratory. Right off a mile from our campus, we have one of the most open and extraordinary laboratories to look at ocean and coastal issues. And climate is the new driver for those issues, the issue that really has a lot of people's attention and I think has really upped the ante about what our concerns are. So let me talk first a little bit about the climate executive order and why it makes a difference. First of all, the Biden administration, I want to say, has been very explicit about its priorities and has been pretty disciplined in sticking to those priorities. And they relate to some of the climate issues. Their priorities are economic recovery, COVID, climate, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And all of those issues really are significant for where we are in New Jersey and also in Florida along the coast, and I'll explain why. The executive order really focuses on a whole variety of things. I could spend the entire half hour of this session reading the executive order, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on three elements that I think are relevant to what we're doing and what I think we all care of as community members and who live in coastal states. One is a focus on renewable energy. Really, I think what you are going to see is a lot of interest and focus on renewable energy and investment in that. So really track what the administration is doing on that. That's specifically important, obviously, to the Mid-Atlantic in our laboratory because we are the epicenter for offshore wind development. So we are actually working at Monmouth on a variety of initiatives to try to figure out how we can site those wind farms in a way that also protects the environment. And again, the administration's priority is going to heighten attention to that, and there's a specific call out in that to expedite siting of those and do it in a way that's ecologically sound. We have a specific project we work on. Monmouth was actually the PI for many years on the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal project, which is actually an incredible asset to actually map and actually look spatially at all of the uses off the Mid-Atlantic. And there's similar activities in other regions of the country as well. So we do think that that's going to be an area where UCI will be able to continue to play a role, and this administration will actually increase attention and focus on those issues. Another area is really conservation. So again, you can't love the coast and think about it unless you also love conservation and protection of the environment. And another call in the executive order is to protect 30% of all lands and waters by 2030. So that 30 by 30. So there's actually a specific call out to think about how do we support these uses of the ocean. And no matter where you live, if you live near the coast, you recognize it's a space that there's a lot of activity in, whether you're in Florida or New Jersey, maritime commerce, offshore energy, recreational fisheries. There's a lot of demand for use of the ocean. So thinking how we can do this in a way that actually conserves the environment at the same time is another challenge that the executive order sets out for us. And we have been working in the Mid-Atlantic to actually do some mapping on the portal of all of the major species to really identify ecological richness, not only in the ocean, but also in the terrestrial environment, to be sure you don't have conflicts with birds and bats and wind farms. So it's the thing about the ocean that's so exciting is it's a 3 or 4 dimensional space. It's not just like the terrestrial environment. So it's a very complicated area. And that's another focus that the new administration will place is on science. It issued an executive order also elevating science. So the way and the model for UCI to work is actually to use science to actually inform management and policy decisions. So you'll see a lot more attention to some of the work that folks like Dr. Harrington and Dr. Adolph do to actually apply that information in ways that influence those decisions. So I think you have a lot of areas in which you'll have, I think, greater attention under this administration to issues of importance to the coast. The last area of the executive order I'll mention, and there's many others, is actually its focus on looking at what Dr. Harrington will talk to a little bit, is actually sea level rise and coastal storms, really trying to enable communities to adapt to those storms. And that's something that's happening up and down the coast, maybe even more dramatically in Florida. And Tom will talk to that a little bit, than New Jersey, but an issue of great significance and importance, and I think will get a lot more attention under this administration. So thinking about those issues and thinking about what the opportunities are for UCI to address those issues. And I will reflect that those similar issues are also priorities at the governor's and state level. So again, in both Florida and in New Jersey, you also have a lot of attention by the governors. Even though they're very different parties and very different philosophies, they do actually both prioritize trying to figure out how we're going to adapt to rising sea levels and climate change. So that's going to be an issue of importance. I'll kind of conclude by just mentioning a couple of things that we're working on and a couple of issues that are coming out of the federal level as well. One is something called the Ocean Planning Committee. And that is something that actually UCI has been involved with from the very beginning, because UCI actually supports something called the Regional Ocean Partnership, where we actually coordinate the meetings of the 5 states in the Mid-Atlantic from Virginia up to New York for annual meetings to discuss what issues we should work on with the federal agencies around regional ocean planning issues. And that's supported by the Federal Ocean Planning Committee. And with support from partners, that's actually been incorporated into law now, and you'll see that being a much more important feature of the activities of this new administration. And I think UCI and our partners will be front and center in trying to work through our regional ocean planning work and the Mid-Atlantic Council on the Ocean to really look at how we can really compatibly develop those issues. There's kind of a new theme that this administration also will embrace, which is something that's relevant, is thinking about a sustainable blue economy. How do we think about this economic recovery and reset in a way that's actually going to support maritime commerce, support offshore wind, support fisheries, support other ocean environments? When we recognize we're a maritime nation and most of our economy is either near the coast or uses and accesses the coast and oceans, you recognize how important that is to recovery. And the thought is maybe we will do that differently in the future than we've done it in the past. So you'll see a lot of attention both at UCI in Florida and at the national level on sustainable blue economy and recovery based on COVID. I'll conclude now just to sort of really get time for my co-presenters to really talk by talking a little bit about the fact that you'll also see a great focus on what is broadly considered infrastructure investment. So they're currently discussing the first round of investment for COVID recovery, which is really directly at the COVID recovery. But they're also talking about a second round of investment to actually make sure that we can sustain what we have. So all of the small businesses in Florida, all of the small businesses in New Jersey, all of the travel and tourism businesses that have been really particularly impacted by this pandemic and by the closures, I think there will be a lot of attention, and I think this and hope this will be bipartisan, to think about how we recover those industries and how we actually think about them in the future in ways that will make them sustainable and not actually subject to further disruptions in the future. So that'll be a big area. And you'll also see a lot of focus in the next round, once I hopefully get in some way through this COVID recovery package, to be thinking about an infrastructure investment package. And again, if you're in states like New Jersey or Florida, which depend on roads and development and coastal communities and maritime commerce and investment in adaptation, we can't just retreat from many of the towns that we live in New Jersey. We can do a better job at planning. We can reduce the risk by developing better, but we also need to be able to adapt to climate change. So you'll see a second round and a lot of attention into infrastructure investment, including investment for infrastructure, natural features, other things that you need to do. And something we all care about in both New Jersey and Florida is our beaches. So I think that's kind of an appropriate way to sort of turn this over to our next presenters. And I'll introduce briefly, and they can add to this as they want. Our first presenter will be Dr. Tom Harrington, and he is the Associate Director of the Urban Coast Institute, and he's a coastal engineer, and he has a particular expertise in sea level rise and coastal processes. So Tom will start us off with some discussions, and then we'll conclude with Professor Adolph, Jason Adolph. He is the endowed Associate Professor of Biology, and he is a great collaborator with the Urban Coast Institute. And I should mention, this is just two. We have a very deep bench at Monmouth of partners to work on issues like this, including our students. And we also have an endowed professor of marine law and policy, and also, and his name is Randy Abate. And this year we've added a professor, associate professor of environmental economics in the business school. So we're really trying to take an all hands on deck approach to looking at these issues. And with that, I will turn it over to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. I have slides, so I'm an old professor that can't get away from old habits. So I was going to show you a few things to emphasize some of the work we've been doing with our students and communities in New Jersey. And let me start this slideshow. Here we go. Oh, that's way too early in my presentation. So as Tony mentioned, one of my focus areas is looking at the impacts of sea level rise on coastal communities. And to be honest, the coastal communities are going to feel the impacts of climate change first. And they're already feeling them, actually, as we think about what's happening today. And so what I'm showing you here are two tide gauge records that NOAA has collected for the last 100 years in both locations, Naples, Florida, and Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And the reason I show you these two graphs is to show how similar the trends are in New Jersey as they are in Florida. And so over the past century, since 1920, both gauges have been observing a mean sea level rise of about 3 to 4 millimeters per year, which translates into about 1 foot to 1.5 foot rise in sea level at the locations. And so if you notice these two orange lines and the thick line in the center, they're kind of the projected ranges of future sea level based on what we think the climate may do, depending on if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at our current rate. We may see a higher sea level rise than we're seeing now, or if we reduce those emissions, we may see a lower sea level rise, but still a rise in the sea level. And so right now, both locations should expect to see somewhere between 6 to 15 inches of additional sea level rise by 2040. And so that's where the issues lie for our coastal communities, because as sea levels rise, the mean sea level is getting closer to our physical streets, our houses, our infrastructure. And so today, because of this century-long, or actually longer rise in sea level, we are beginning to notice impacts that we commonly refer to as sunny day tidal flooding. And we both observe these impacts, both in Florida, which is the picture on the left, as in New Jersey, which is on the right. And both of these photos are just a depiction of what happens when the tidal elevation gets around mean or higher high water, or maybe a little bit higher, right? And so we're starting to see that, sure, we can kind of exist with this little bit of water in our streets, but it is an inconvenience. It's an inconvenience if you're going to try to maintain your scooter. It's an inconvenience if you want to get out of your house to go to the doctor. And so we're hearing from our coastal residents that we need to do something about this in order to really preserve the quality of life that we have in our coastal communities. And so since the two tidal gauges are kind of comparable, I'm just going to focus on our work in New Jersey at the moment. But this is a table of sea level rise projections that was produced by an academic panel that was led by Rutgers University. And I just want to show you that basically there's a range of probable sea level rises since 2000. And they kind of increase as we go out in time from 2030 to 2100. And I'm just going to focus on the 50% chance. And this is about what we saw in the tide gauge records at Naples and in New Jersey, that we should see somewhere between 1/8 of a foot sea level rise to 1.5 feet by 2050. And then when we get out to 2070 and 2100, there's some variability in that depending on how much greenhouse gas emissions we still have going into the atmosphere. And so there's a little less uncertainty about those numbers. But I do want to show you that there's no range in 2030 or 2050. And that's because the ocean has absorbed so much heat. 90% of the global warming has gone into the oceans. And so sea level rise, at least out to 2050, is certainly unstoppable at this point, and probably will not be reduced in any significant way. And so the present problems we have are typically going to get worse. And I'd also like to just point out that sea level is just one part of the problem. Sure, it's rising, but we still have coastal storms and hurricanes and other events that create storm tides. And those storm tides are riding on top of higher sea levels. And so they become more impactful over time. And so we've done some work in the communities. This is a messy graph, I know, but bear with me. But we've been working through the Sea Grant program here in New Jersey to really understand what sea level rise means in terms of how many times your street's going to be flooded. And so if we look at the tide record from Atlantic City, we can look at every high tide over 20 years, and we can get a prediction of how many high tides per year should be above a certain water elevation. And so it looks like this. This is basically how many tides per year I should expect water levels to be -1 foot below mean sea level, almost every tide. And then I can say, well, how many tides will be 2 feet above mean sea level? And that's about half the tides, which makes sense. And so if we superimpose the tidal range, we see most of the tides at Atlantic City fall within the tide predictions. But we have this tail out here, which are the coastal storms. And they're the ones we're really concerned about because they're going to cause the problems in our communities. And so what happens with sea level rise is that these tidal curves, this is the one from 2018 we analyzed, and I've just added the numbers, the 50% numbers from that table I showed you, out to 2100. And I can see that I get more and more tides above mean sea level as I go out in time. And if I have a reference point I'm interested in, let's say a roadway I know that I need as an access point to get on and off a barrier island or on and off a key, then I can kind of get a sense for how much impact these new storm surges will be on top of the elevated sea levels. And so in this case, we were working with a community group in Ocean City. And we said, this is the access way. How many times does it flood? Well, actually, today, at the present day sea level, we should expect that roadway to flood 24 times a year. By 2030, just because we elevated the sea level just a little bit, we should expect that roadway to flood 130 times. By 2050, 300 times. That's every other high tide. And so this is the impact you can see just looking at the historic record of high tides and what we should expect with sea level rise. And so I show this because it's not a linear impact. It's actually very much a parabolic impact. Everything is increasing exponentially. And so the impacts will increase exponentially as well. And that's not incorporating the fact that it actually rains at the coast too. And so this is something we're really working, our students at Monmouth, our community in Ocean City, and Sea Grant are working to understand what are the rainfall impacts to flooding with the elevated sea levels. And so in Ocean City, we have this group collecting data all the time. They actually measure rainfall in rain gauges. They take photos of when it floods, they put it in an app, and that sends this information to us. And we can begin to analyze this information. And what we're learning from this is that right now, after 2 years of data collection, Ocean City experiences 45 flood events per year. That's double what we expected just from the tidal gauge analysis. And so not only do we have the storm surges and the tides, but we also have rainfall itself creating flood issues when the tides are too high. And so I just wanted to end with some thoughts about what this means for the coast and what maybe we can do to address it. And the first conclusion is that what we're seeing in the data is that we're already really experiencing these climate-driven impacts at the coast. And they're pretty impactful, and they're going to get worse very quickly. And so, so how do we address that? Well, most of our existing climate policy doesn't address mitigation. It addresses the emission reduction aspect. And so we really need to think about how are we going to begin to build resilience through mitigation into our coastal communities. And so two things the Biden administration has available to it. One, as Tony mentioned, in its climate and energy programs, there is this, what they call a civilian climate corps, which is going to be designed to help restore ecosystems that provide community resilience. And this is something that we think would really benefit communities that we can implement it. And the second thing is, in the Trump administration, after the really impactful hurricanes in 2017 from Harvey and Maria, FEMA requested a change in the structure of their pre-disaster mitigation funding. And so Congress passed in 2017 what they called the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which actually receives 6% of the annual presidentially declared disaster grants that they can put away for pre-disaster mitigation grants for communities. And this is a pretty big fund. In terms of funding right now, it's at about $500 million. But if, and this is what's being discussed in Washington right now, if we can use the COVID disaster relief funds and include that in the 6%, that fund will balloon to over $10 billion, which would really give communities the ability to really begin to address these issues. And so we think that's an area where we could really focus in on trying to urge our congressional representatives to make that happen. And so with that, I'll stop there and pass it along to Jason.
Thanks, Tom. And hello, everybody. Good evening to you. My name is Jason Adolph. I'm the endowed associate professor of marine science at Monmouth University in the biology department and with the Urban Coast Institute. I do have a few slides, just pictures. I didn't put any graphs up for once in my life. Okay, great. Let's see. So you're seeing the full screen or the presenter screen? I think you're seeing the full screen now. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a phytoplankton ecologist. I work on a group of organisms called phytoplankton. I usually have to start off by explaining what they are. These are the single-celled organisms that do primary production in the oceans, and they're a normal and useful part of the ecosystem and the global system. On a global basis, every other breath we take, the oxygen in that breath came from phytoplankton. Photosynthesizing in the ocean, the other breath would have come from photosynthesis on land, from forests and such. But there are some types of phytoplankton that cause these things called HABs, or harmful algal blooms, or HABs. And the picture that we're looking at here are two examples. On the top is a freshwater HAB caused by a group of phytoplankton called cyanobacteria. These are often described as spilled paint on water. That's what they look like. they make some really nasty liver and neurotoxins that are dangerous to wildlife and humans. And on the bottom, we're looking at an image of a marine hab, or more commonly called a red tide, that which occurred saltwater in the oceans. The thing about Florida that's interesting to have people is you're kind of the epicenter for both of these types of habs. Back in 2019, especially, I'm sure y'all remember you had dueling habs on the Gulf side and the Atlantic side and Lake Okeechobee, killing all sorts of marine and freshwater wildlife, and even the occasional criminal that jumped into a lagoon to try to escape arrest. I'll never forget that story. I saw in the news. So this is the main red tide that Florida experiences. It's a dinoflagella called Karenia brevis, and it makes a neurotoxin called brevetoxin. One of the indirect effects of this that maybe you've experienced, I know I experienced at one time at a HAB meeting of all places down in St. Pete, Florida, is the respiratory distress and discomfort that people feel along the beach when the waves are chopping up this in the surf zone and aerosolizing the toxin that it makes. Asthmatics are particularly sensitive to that. And then this is, I'm sure you're familiar with Lake Okeechobee. This has kind of become an incubator of cyanobacterial freshwater blooms, toxic blooms, in the middle of the state, receiving the drainage from the surrounding farmland. And the St. Lucia Canal is pointed out there, and the issues in 2019 stem largely from a bloom setting up in Lake Okeechobee and then being sent down the canal towards the coast, the Atlantic coast, where it flooded lagoons and caused toxicity problems. So we have HABs here in New Jersey also, but all of us HAB people in the country kind of always keep a close eye on Florida as, like I said, kind of the epicenter. The unfortunate fact about HABs is that they've been getting worse over time. And this includes that places like Florida, where HABs have been around for decades, are seeing longer, bigger HABs and more problems from them. And places that haven't had particular HAB issues before, including New Jersey and places in New England, are seeing first-time events of toxicity events that, for instance, close fisheries because of new harmful algal bloom problems. We know pretty well what the two main causes of HABs are and the worsening of HABs, and those are climate change, particularly increases in sea surface temperature and lake temperatures, as well as increased rain and changing rainfall patterns in different environments. And the rain in particular exacerbates an existing problem called eutrophication, which is the overloading of, or caused by the overloading of waterways, freshwater or coastal marine, with nutrients, basically our waste products from agriculture and animal waste, including our own waste. Sewage would be part of that. So phytoplankton, like I said in the beginning, they're basically like plants. They live on the same stuff that the plants in the garden live on. They like inorganic nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and sunlight. And eutrophication is the process of giving them way, way too much nitrogen and phosphorus, which causes these excessive growths and growths of different species to occur in different areas, like I'm showing here with Lake Okeechobee, and what happens in the coastal ocean. Climate change, as the water temperature in areas like this is increasing, what we're seeing is, especially in lakes, the other species of lakes, so there'd be normally thousands and thousands of species of phytoplankton in a given lake, but when a bloom occurs, that all gets contracted down to one or two or a subset of species. And those are species that are able to tolerate the temperatures that lakes are reaching now. The others are outcompeted because the lake has left their desirable habitat window. and they just get outcompeted by cyanobacteria, these bloom organisms that can handle that kind of heat. So at Monmouth University, we, meaning my students and I, and in collaboration with UCI and other partners around the state and the country, are working on these issues. I run a lab called the Fab Lab there, the Phytoplankton Harmful Algal Lab, Harmful Algal Bloom Lab, sorry. And we're working on several projects. Our big waterway here between New Jersey and New York is called the Hudson-Raritan Estuary. And we go out and track down and look for the causes of HABs occurring in that environment. And then we work in lakes as well, except we work in a special type of lake called a coastal lake, which has a connection to the ocean. And historically it was more like an estuary, but now they're heavily populated, very urbanized environments with a connection to the sea still. And they have those freshwater harmful algal blooms I talked about. And then there are other projects that I'm not going to go into right now because they're not associated with HABs that are shown here. So what do we do about HABs? We know from the scientist's perspective these big issues. And the way I think about the what to do list is to break it down in kind of a nested set of actions. In the long term, we have to talk about climate legislation. We have to slow climate change, limit, if not stop, greenhouse gas emissions and stop the warming and the changing climate patterns on the planet. Another long-term goal, which is not going to happen overnight, is to do watershed restoration and management so that runoff containing nutrients that feed these lakes and coastal areas is slowed down and the nutrients are captured and recycled on land instead of being dumped into the ocean or the lakes directly. On a more short-term list of to-do, we have to think about strategies for lake and or coastal ocean management that allows us to mitigate the effects of blooms. And one of those important short-term goals is monitoring and surveillance and forecasting. While we have to live with these, while these long-term actions are being undertaken, it's important that we know when they're going to come and what kind of toxicity is going to be associated with them. And that just takes a lot of looking, observing, and sampling. One of the strategies for doing that I'd love to talk more about, although I'm going to end here, is citizen scientists. Citizen scientists have a great stake in these environments because that's where they live and that's where they recreate. And we've been really successful in training and using citizen scientists to help us monitor coastal lakes for HABs. And so solutions like this are what we need to think of in the short term while we're working on the long-term solutions. So I'll end there. And thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And so I think we have a fairly small group tonight too. So again, I'm just going to encourage folks, if they would like to ask a question, you can simply unmute yourself and ask that question. You're certainly welcome to put something in the chat if you're shy and you just want us to look at it. We will look at that, but we do encourage you to open up the mic and either share some comments or questions for anybody in the audience or any of your perspectives, because I think you might have some thoughts about what's going on as well. So let's open it up for the next 10 minutes or so, and that would be great. And do me a favor introducing yourself. Just not everybody on the call knows you, so if folks want to jump on. Got a question?
Yeah, I'll start off. So yeah, I'm John Harvey, a longtime resident of Monmouth County, but now I live in the first coast of Florida, which represents the Jacksonville beaches, Ponte Vedra beaches, and St. Augustine beaches. Yeah. For Dr. Harrington, he mentioned the notion of ecosystems that improve community resilience. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. The first thing that comes to my thought is, especially which is prominent here in the first line of defense for coastal flooding, is very large vegetative dunes. And they do an amazing job. They protect, real estate, they protect, ocean coming over onto our streets. They're much more massive and much more vegetative than anything I ever saw in New Jersey. So for Dr. Harrington, I was wondering, is that an example of an ecosystem to improve community resilience? And then what are other examples of types of ecosystems? Thank you.
Yeah, sure, John. Thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. That is probably the poster child of ecosystem resilience. I'm not sure which beach you're referring to, but I know St. Augustine and Jacksonville complex beaches have been renourished by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so that's an example of how we're going in to recreate a natural system to the best of our ability that has been eroded over time. And, to be honest, in the beginning, New Jersey's the pioneer in a lot of these ideas. And we didn't put dunes on the back of the beaches. We just put a wide, flat beach. And we learned a lesson in Sandy, which is what you've observed, that those big dunes are really important to preventing that storm surge from overwashing the beaches. And the more vegetated they are, the better. And so certainly part of what we do now. And your second question, what other kind of examples though? Since Hurricane Sandy, in this region at least, there's been a lot of discussion about restoring natural marshes, restoring the sediment supply that has been removed from the system in our back bays to help build up those existing natural platforms that provide a little bit of flood reduction and friction for wave energy. And so there's a lot of ideas about how to integrate that into long-term resilience.
Good, thank you.
Great. Other comments, questions? Don't be shy. Friendly group here.
I actually was going to hop in and ask a question, Laura
Great,
McDonald.
thank
I'm
you.
I'm the director of alumni engagement here at Monmouth. I'm sure I've met a lot of you or emailed with you, but just as residents of all of these coastal towns and folks who, like me, most of us on this call do not do this for a living, what would be your top things that just residents of the coast can do on a daily basis to help flatten that curve a little bit? I know it takes a lot of people, and the little steps maybe don't feel like they're always making a difference, but in your opinions, what would be the top 2 or 3 things you would suggest people to start doing to help with the climate change problem?
Well, I'll start off, and Tom can think, and I maybe talk on Tom's, but I do think it's definitely thinking about, from a resilience perspective, one property alone isn't going to make a difference, but I do think about how we move away from hard structures and how we move to more natural environments that absorb more water. So really thinking about everything from stormwater management to other issues about how you can actually manage a lot of that. So the more you can reduce the water flow from the rainfalls, and the more you can actually ameliorate some of the flooding. That it's hard to, it won't make a huge difference site by site, but if you think about everybody community changing the way they approach that. I live here on Deal Lake, and I'm right on the lake, but I've noticed some local homeowners putting up a little sign saying they're planting refugia, both for absorbing some of that runoff as well as creating some minimal protection. So again, I think that's one level. In terms of the climate side of the equation, I think it's sort of like, it's what I would call, first of all, thinking very much about your own carbon footprint and how you impact that. So there's a lot of people, again, not everybody agrees with every recommendation, but a lot of folks saying everything from your diet, reducing your intake of red meat can actually have, over time, a significant impact on pollution. Thinking about what your own carbon footprint is, how you take that into account can make a huge difference. And then also what I would say, kind of the other thing about that is you see a lot of movement in the business and industry community to shareholder value, and thinking about how to redefining shareholder value more broadly in terms of environmental and social guidelines. So, you might think you don't have a say, but I do think there is, both your politicians and your business communities are very responsive to community demands. So I would think about your individual actions and how do you model them within community groups and getting involved at the community scale. That stuff really starts to snowball pretty quickly. I like to say, if I want to get anything done at Monmouth, I love to work with the professors, but I just ask a couple of students to sort of get a thing going, and the administration responds right away. And I think that kind of model actually is transferable out into the real world as well. So So those are my thoughts. Jason or Tom, you have any other suggestions that occur to you?
You know, I'm thinking of at the beginning of the shutdown back in April, through the wrong mechanism, we did the right thing, and there was much less traffic in New Jersey, for instance. This isn't a directly relevant thing, but it's an example. And actually, UCI hosted a webinar about it, and we had somebody from New Jersey DOT show us that the 35% reduction in traffic in New Jersey resulted in about a 35% improvement in air quality, measured as particulate aerosols. And I just thought that was a great example of how if we do change things, we see results quickly in some instances. That's not going to be the case for everything, of course. Things like climate are going to be a long-term a battle of changes that have to happen. But
yeah, I think there are other great examples on that. There was a great one about we're seeing off the coast of New Jersey more whales and everything. Nobody's exactly sure why, but there's some reasonable speculation that the decrease in noise from all of the maritime traffic might have actually created a more favorable environment for them, as well as essentially the greater productivity of some of their feed fish, the menhaden and other issues. So there was a lot of great stories. This was a really fun little workshop that Jason participated in, where people talked about some of the lessons learned and the way nature back after during COVID because of the decrease in activity. It was really cool.
The view, John, you said you were from Monmouth County. The view of Manhattan from Sandy Hook, or even from Seabright, was amazing during that period because of the city's air pollution had gone down so much. It was a noticeably different and clearer view. I tried to get pictures of it, but I couldn't get any good ones.
Great. Andrea?
Hi everyone. I'm Andrea Jomedies. My daughter is a student at Monmouth. And so how does all the water between New Jersey and Florida factor into the equation, or is that a whole nother session?
Tell me the question. All the water between New Jersey and Florida. So
you're focused on New Jersey and the impact, and you talk specifically about Florida. So what about the Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia coast?
So I would say similar issues. As I pointed out, there's a couple of activities that we're involved in. We're just scratching the surface here. But a lot of these efforts, these regional ocean planning efforts that we talked about, are actually looking at things regionally. So there is actually a lot of focus about regional things, but there's also, and Tom can expand on this a little bit, I think there's a lot of interest in another group we work with, which is the Integrated Ocean Observing Systems, that are actually regional systems that are up and down the coast, that are part of a national network, that are looking at both the physics and chemistry of the ocean. So they're looking at actually how the water moves, because we're really realizing that sometimes, in addition to the temperature impacts, how warm the water is, where it's moving, where the tide's going, that can impact a lot of things, significant potential future impacts on things like the Gulf Stream. So there is a whole other community that we partner with that's looking at what you would call the ecosystem considerations of what's happening within the marine environment, whether it's the physical or chemical or the biological. So there's a lot of parallel efforts to some of the specific work we do that's looking at that. And there's also a whole network of what I would call similar partners. So we work through things like the National Estuary Program. There's a lot of subsidiary programs that are up and down the National Estuary Research Reserve that look at these issues on a place-based way, but are trying to connect it more to the scale that you're talking about. So I don't know, Tom or Jason, do you have any other thoughts?
I would add that from a sea level rise perspective, actually there's winners and losers along our coast. I was interested to find that New Jersey and Florida are pretty much the same, where places as Norfolk, Virginia, their sea levels are rising much quicker because their land is sinking much faster. So there are these variations in the region, but we all face the same problem, which is that our feet are going to be wetter more often. And And to Tony's point, yeah, we are much more connected than you would think because of the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream that moves by Florida comes up here rather quickly. And with it comes all the species. And as that Gulf Stream changes and water temperatures change, you know, we're starting to see shifts in the types of fish we have off New Jersey and other parts of the East Coast. We're seeing the range of species kind of change. And so I think that's something Jason's paying more attention to me, but that's another aspect of it.
People who look at harmful algal bloom species, like Karenia that I showed a picture of which is not only in Florida, but infamous in Florida. Pretty much every year that's detected as the warm water comes up the eastern seaboard, but never much further north than like Maryland, and doesn't cause the sorts of problems there that it does in Florida. But we know that the currents bring the water from Florida, the Atlantic coast of Florida, up the coast, and the organisms along with it. So there's definitely connectivity, as you were saying, and it's true. It doesn't cause problems currently, but if you're going to start talking about changing ocean temperatures and changing currents, then you have to factor that in. You know, the source is there. It just kind of runs out of temperature when it reaches Maryland. But if that changes over time, it can be a different situation.
And two other examples that occur to me is, you know, one canary in the coal mine is the right whale. So, you know, that travels. We don't know much about its life cycle, but we do know that it's an endangered species and at risk. And so that actually is something we're looking at closely, and we're working. So when you talk about climate action, to look at how do you reduce carbon emissions from the maritime industry. And so thinking about that as a function also of its impact on marine mammals and wildlife is kind of something that we will look at in our region, but we will have to talk to the other regions about if we're going to actually think about the full life cycle of the right whale. And kind of for the other end of that spectrum, we are actually working, and Carl, our communications director, actually hosted a workshop with the Coast Guard on navigation safety and port access route studies. So the Coast Guard does these studies to be sure that all of the port, we all have ports up and down the coast. I did a stint at one point working for the American Association of Port Authorities, and we're trying to figure out how you actually create these pathways for maritime commerce in a way that efficient, but also don't impact the environment significantly and don't conflict with other uses. So we, through our Ocean Data Portal project, are looking at that. But in fact, the Coast Guard was interested in it from a whole Atlantic coast perspective. So they are developing these studies all from Florida all the way on up to Maine. So there's a lot of overlap. Again, we like to say we're focused sometimes on our backyard and our region, but we think most of what we do is transferable, and almost anything that the folks I work with do, often they're working with a partner in another region to work on some issues. So I work closely with a collaborator at Miami who's looking at resilience issues as well, and we compare notes regarding some of the resilience strategies that they're using there and how they're using them in other areas of the country. So it's great. Thank you for your question. Other questions or comments? We're approaching the hour here. I think we had said 45 minutes, so I appreciate folks sticking with us. And again, there are many opportunities to get involved with Monmouth and with the Urban Coast Institute. If you want to find out more, please reach out to Laura or Carl, and we'll be sure to follow up. So we have a great team, and it goes, as I said, much broader than the 4 folks that you met tonight. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. So one last shot for anybody. Okay, Laura, is there anything you want to say before we conclude tonight?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining, and absolutely thank you, Tony and Tom and Jason and Carl, the team here, for putting this on. It was really interesting. Thank you guys so much. And as Tony mentioned, if anybody needs anything or has any questions, you all have my email address. I'll throw it in the chat really quick. Happy to connect anybody if you have any more questions. But other than that, thank you so much.
We would love to do this in Florida or any place else up and down the coast next year. So we're very happy. We will travel. We'll take the show on the road anywhere between here and Florida or Maine. So please invite us, and we'll be sure to come down if we can meet you in person. That would be great. All the best, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.